Welcome to Reformed Thinking.
Yes, glad to be here with you today.
You know, usually when we talk about a physical mechanism, there is this expectation of precision.
Right, like with engineering or, anatomy.
Yeah, if you fall off a ladder and your arm hurts, you go to the hospital.
And they take an x-ray.
They take an x-ray, and it shows that jagged white line right there on the screen.
The doctor just points at it and says, well, there is the fracture.
It is very binary. I mean, it is clean. You do not debate the philosophy of the bone.
No, you just look at the mechanics of the brake.
Or, think about a car engine. If the pistons are firing, the crankshaft turns.
And if the fuel line is cut, the engine stops.
Right. The physical world gives us these rigid, very reliable laws of cause and effect.
And honestly, we find a lot of comfort in that predictability.
We really do. We like things to be visible, neatly categorized, and operating according to rules we can actually observe.
Absolutely.
But then you step into the world of human decision-making, theology, and the invisible mechanics of choice.
And suddenly that x-ray machine is completely broken.
It is. We are looking at a philosophical landscape that is, well, honestly, it is completely murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
You ask 10 different people how human free will operates, and you will get 10 different, often contradictory answers.
Yeah, the moment you move from the physical anatomy of the brain to the spiritual anatomy of the soul, people just abandon the rules of logic that they rely on for everything else in life.
They really do. They start inventing these mystical floating concepts of human autonomy that just, defy reason.
But the brilliant thing about the text we are examining today is that the author refuses to let us get away with that.
Right. He insists on bringing that same level of rigorous X-ray precision to the human will.
I am so glad we are doing this because today we are taking a deep dive into why that x-ray machine of human choice is broken and how to fix it.
We have a massive stack of notes and excerpts in front of us from Jonathan Edwards' classic theological treatise, Freedom of the Will.
It is a massive text.
It really is. And our specific mission today is to thoroughly investigate Edwards' systematic dismantling of the Arminian view of human liberty.
Right. Specifically, we are looking at the idea that the human will possesses an autonomous, self-determining capacity that is totally unlinked to any prior cause.
Now, you might be listening to this and wondering why you should care about an 18th century philosophical argument.
You might be thinking, I just need to get through my workday.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds so academic.
Yeah.
But the reality is that how you define your own freedom dictates how you view God's sovereignty.
Absolutely.
It dictates how you view human responsibility and the actual mechanics of the choices you make every single day.
If you get the definition of freedom wrong, your entire theological framework shifts.
It does, and that gives us a clear lay of the land for our investigation.
What is fascinating here is that Edwards does not rely on emotional appeals to make his case.
No, he does not try to manipulate your feelings at all.
Instead, he uses razor-sharp logic to prove that the Arminian concept of a completely independent, neutral will is a mathematical and philosophical contradiction.
He takes their premises, assumes they are true for the sake of argument, and walks them out to their inevitable logical conclusions.
Right. He shows how those premises just collapse under their own weight.
He proves that such an autonomous capacity cannot exist in any created being.
It is a masterful exercise in logical reduction, demonstrating that what many people call free will is actually an impossible fiction.
Okay, let us unpack this step by step. We were jumping right into the initial sections of the text.
Yes, sections 1 and 2.
Right. To begin, we need to understand the opposing view that Edwards is targeting.
So Arminian theology proposes that the essence of moral liberty consists in the will determining its own free acts.
They argue for a self-determining capacity within the will itself.
Now, Edwards starts by pointing out a basic flaw in how we even talk about this.
Yeah, drawing on the philosopher John Locke, right?
Yes. He notes that actions belong to agents, not to the properties of agents.
So it is improper to say the will decides, because the will is just a faculty.
Right. It is an attribute. The correct phrasing is that the soul or the person decides, using their capacity of willing.
We often talk about the will as if it is a little person sitting inside our heads.
Yeah, like a homunculus making choices independently of our minds.
But Edwards grants them their phrasing for the sake of argument.
He does. He assumes they mean the soul determining its own volitions.
He is incredibly generous in granting their definitions before he dismantles them.
He really is. He says, fine, let us assume the will determines its own acts.
Okay.
If the will determines its own acts, it must do so by making a choice.
Right. The will determines things by choosing them.
Therefore, every free act of choice is determined by a preceding act of choice.
Think about the geometry of that for a second.
Yeah, map it out. If your current choice was determined by your will, then your will had to make a choice to determine that choice.
And if that preceding choice was also free, it had to be determined by an even earlier choice.
This creates an impossible infinite regress.
You have an endless chain of choices going backward forever.
Right. Or you eventually hit a first choice that was not determined by a preceding choice.
But if that first choice was not determined by the will, then by their own definition, it was not free.
Spot on. And if the first choice in the chain is not free, none of the subsequent choices caused by it can be free either.
I want to make sure we make this highly concrete, so I'm going to build an analogy here.
Go for it.
Imagine a freight train sitting on a set of tracks.
Oh, okay. A train.
Let us say this train consists of 5 connected train cars.
All hooked together.
Yeah. The 5th car is moved by the 4th car. The 4th car is moved by the 3rd car.
The 3rd is moved by the 2nd, and the 2nd is moved by the 1st.
Everything is connected, and the motion is transferred down the line.
But what moves the 1st car?
Right. If the 1st car does not have an engine, if it does not have an independent source of motion, then none of the following cars move.
Thus, a free act cannot be the cause of the very first free act.
If the first act is not free, if it is determined by something outside the will, like a locomotive pulling from the outside, then the whole chain is determined from the outside.
You cannot have 10,000 links in a chain where the first link is moved by an outside force and then claim the subsequent links are moving themselves.
The whole concept of a self-determining chain of choices is mathematically impossible.
Precisely. The logic there is airtight.
It is like falling dominoes. If the first domino is pushed by an outside finger, every subsequent domino falling is the result of that initial outside force.
And Edwards anticipates the evasions people will try to use to escape this trap.
He knows what they're going to say.
He does. He asks, what if the Arminian claims it is the faculty of the soul, not a prior act, that determines the choice?
So what if the capacity itself just generates the choice without a preceding action?
Edwards responds using flawless logic. He says, for a faculty to determine anything, it must act.
To determine a choice is to perform an action.
Right, and action requires a prior cause.
You cannot have a dormant capacity suddenly produce an effect without an action bringing that effect into existence.
Think about a sleeping man who has the physical capacity to run.
That capacity sits completely dormant.
For that capacity to produce the effect of running, an action must occur to wake him up and trigger the muscles.
The contradiction remains unbroken. The determining act must be distinct from the act being determined.
You cannot be the cause of your own existence before you exist.
Wait, I might push back here on behalf of someone analyzing this for the first time.
Sure, what is the objection?
What if they try to collapse the timeline? What if they say, well, the soul exerts a volition, and that exertion is the determination?
Meaning it happens at the identical split second.
Yeah, they might say the exertion is both the cause and the effect simultaneously. Does that solve the infinite regress?
That is a clever attempt.
Because if they happen together, there is no chain going backward, right?
Edwards addresses that specific defense, and he shows why it fails.
How does he dismantle that?
He points out that making the exertion both the cause and the effect is nonsensical.
Right.
If the choice is determined at all, it has a reason for existing in a specific way rather than another way.
And that reason must be distinct from and prior to the effect.
Yes. To say the soul orders itself to act by the very act itself is like saying a house built itself by the act of being built.
Or that a book wrote itself by the act of being written.
The cause must precede the effect, at least in the order of nature, if not in time.
You must have a builder before you have a building.
Therefore, because Edwards establishes that a choice cannot cause itself without leading to an infinite regress or a logical absurdity, we are forced to ask the next logical question.
Right. Which means if we accept that choices cannot cause themselves without creating an endless loop, we are forced into an even stranger corner.
We really are.
We have to ask, can a choice just happen out of thin air, uncaused?
Let us investigate the concept of contingence.
Arminians argue that for a choice to be truly free, it must be a contingent event.
Right. And in this philosophical context, contingent means it comes to pass without any preceding necessity or cause.
It is a completely uncaused event that just springs into reality.
To tackle this bizarre claim, Edwards first defines what a cause actually is.
He uses the word in a broad philosophical sense.
A cause is anything that is the ground or reason why an event happens this way rather than another way.
It does not always mean a positive, productive force.
No, not at all. For instance, the absence of the sun is the cause of water freezing at night.
The absence of the sun is not actively doing something.
Right. It is a negative cause, but it is still the true, reliable reason why the water freezes.
It provides the condition for the effect.
Edwards argues that nothing begins to exist without a cause. This is a basic dictate of human common sense.
If things could pop into existence without causes, we would lose all rational proof for the existence of God.
I want to pause right there because that is a massive statement.
It really is. What does this abstract philosophical point mean for the average person's faith?
Why does losing cause and effect destroy the logical proof of God?
Because our primary argument for a creator, as the Apostle Paul lays out in Romans 1, is reasoning from effects back to a first cause.
We look at the universe, we see the intricate design of nature, the stars, the human body, and we recognize that all of this is an effect.
From that effect, we logically deduce it must have a maker.
If events, including human choices, can begin to exist without any cause whatsoever, then why could the universe not begin to exist without a cause?
Wow. If you abandon the universal law of cause and effect to save a philosophical notion of human free will, you accidentally demolish the logical foundation for defending the existence of God.
The atheist could simply say, well, the universe is just a contingent event. It sprang into existence uncaused, just like your human choices do.
Edwards is warning us that the intellectual price tag for Arminian free will is the destruction of Christian apologetics.
That is a staggering consequence. When you put it that way, the stakes are incredibly high.
And to make this relatable, everyday common sense dictates that effects have proportionate causes.
You do not get a massive explosion from a tiny spark unless there is a huge room full of gas.
You do not get an intricate watch without a watchmaker.
Edwards uses this fantastic analogy of rain falling from the sky to illustrate the absurdity of uncaused events.
I love this part. He says, if things happen purely without cause, it would be blind chance.
Nothing has no choice. Nothing cannot discriminate.
So if human volitions happen without a cause, why wouldn't other things happen without a cause?
Why would this effectual no cause exclusively produce water falling from the sky?
Blind chance does not pick and choose its elements.
If non-entity could bring forth existence, we would expect stones, stars, beasts, and angels to pop into existence randomly out of the clouds.
The fact that only water falls from the clouds shows there is a specific, reliable cause for rain.
Similarly, the fact that human volitions follow consistent patterns, like seeking happiness or avoiding pain, shows they have specific, reliable causes.
That analogy highlights the absurdity perfectly.
And when pressed on this, the defenders of uncaused volition often retreat to the idea of the active nature of the soul.
They say, well, the soul is an active spiritual substance, unlike rocks and trees.
Therefore, its active nature is the reason it can make uncaused choices. It just acts because it is its nature to act.
Edwards dismantles this by distinguishing between a general tendency and a specific effect.
A general tendency to be active does not explain why a specific choice is made at a specific time.
I love how he illustrates that. It is like asking, why did this person choose to eat an apple instead of an orange at noon today?
And the answer being, because they have the general biological ability to eat.
That is a terrible answer.
It explains their general capacity to consume food, but it offers absolutely zero explanation for the specific limitation, direction, and determination of that specific act of picking up the apple.
Why the apple? Why at noon? Active nature alone cannot explain why you chose one distinct thing over another in a specific moment.
Spot on. If the soul's general active nature were the sole cause, then the same cause without any variation would produce vastly different effects at different times.
Which contradicts the fundamental nature of causality.
Yes, a uniform cause should produce a uniform effect.
Since choices cannot happen without a cause, and we have already established they cannot cause themselves without an infinite regress, the Arminian defense usually retreats to a third position.
They argue that the mind makes choices in a state of perfect neutrality or equilibrium.
This brings us to a really fascinating part of the discussion, because it touches on how we actually perceive our own decision-making.
The claim here is that liberty requires a state of perfect indifference, where the mind has no prior bias toward one option over another.
The scales are perfectly balanced, the weights are equal on both sides, and the will, in its sovereign capacity, just tips the scale on its own without any prevailing motive.
Edwards absolutely destroys this idea.
His argument is incredibly straightforward. To choose something is to prefer it.
You cannot prefer something while simultaneously remaining perfectly indifferent to it.
Preference and indifference are logical opposites.
They cannot exist in the same subject at the same time regarding the same object.
The moment a choice happens, indifference has vanished.
Therefore, no choice is ever made in a state of freedom if freedom is defined as indifference.
You might be indifferent before the choice, but the act of choosing is the act of ending the indifference.
It is like saying you are sitting completely still in the identical moment you are sprinting across the field.
I want to spend some time on this, because it is so counterintuitive to how we feel.
Right, it feels like we were neutral a lot of the time.
I want to use Edwards' famous chessboard analogy, but let us update it for a modern listener first, and then look at the chessboard.
Okay, let us do the modern version.
Imagine you and I are sitting on the couch on a Friday night. We open up a streaming app, and there are thousands of movies.
And we just stare at the screen.
Yeah, and I say, I am completely indifferent. I do not care what we watch.
It feels like perfect neutrality.
But eventually, I click on a comedy. Why? Not out of pure neutrality, but because my brain subconsciously weighed the exhaustion of my work week and preferred something light over a heavy documentary.
You had a motive, even if it was subtle.
Now, Edwards uses the chessboard to show how we deceive ourselves about this neutrality.
Right, the chessboard.
Imagine I have a chessboard in front of me. You, my friend, asked me to touch any one of the 64 squares.
Okay, just touch any square.
Now, looking at the board, I might feel completely indifferent about the squares themselves. There is nothing inherently better about square A1 compared to square H8.
So it feels like you are making a choice in perfect indifference.
But Edwards points out a massive blind spot in that thinking. You are not choosing the object, the square itself.
Right.
We're choosing the action of touching a spot based on a prevailing inducement.
That distinction between the object and the action is vital.
We confuse our indifference toward the object with an indifference toward the action.
Let us break down the micro steps of that psychological process to see where the motives are hiding.
Okay, let me see if I can map this out step by step.
Walk us through it.
Step 1. I make a general determination to touch a square. Why? Because I have a prevailing motive. I want to fulfill your request.
You are not indifferent about honoring your friend's request.
Right. Step 2. I determine to give myself up to what we call accident. I decide I will just touch whatever square catches my eye first.
Why do you do this?
Because I have a motive to make a quick decision and avoid standing there awkwardly staring at a chessboard all day.
That is a strong motive.
Step 3. My eye falls on a specific square, let us say C4, and I touch it. I yield to accident because I have a prior motive to resolve the situation efficiently.
In none of these steps is the mind actually indifferent.
Every single microaction is driven by a prevailing inducement.
What is illuminating here is how Edwards strips away the illusion of randomness.
Even when we flip a coin to make a decision, the coin toss seems random to us, but the outcome is driven by physics.
Gravity, the force of the thumb, air resistance.
Similarly, the accidents of our thoughts, the wandering of our eyes across a chessboard, have causes.
And more significantly, our decision to rely on those accidents is a highly motivated choice.
Furthermore, Edwards demonstrates that even deciding to suspend a choice is a motivated act.
Right. Let us say you were offered 2 jobs and you say, I'm going to remain indifferent and think about it for a week.
That suspension is a choice driven by a motive.
The motive is your desire for deliberation, your fear of making a mistake, or your desire for more information.
There is no escape from motives. The mind is never in a state of perfect equilibrium when an action is taken.
So if we review where we are, we have proven that the will cannot cause itself.
We have proven that choices cannot be uncaused events popping into existence.
And we have proven that the mind is never truly indifferent or neutral.
The discussion logically flows into determining what actually tips the scales.
If we are never neutral, what exactly drives the human will?
This is where Edwards lays out his positive case.
Yes. In sections 9x and X, he focuses on the relationship between the will, the understanding, and motives.
Edwards asserts a core theological and philosophical truth. The will always follows the last dictate of the understanding.
In other words, We always choose what appears to be the greatest good in the mind's view at that specific split second.
We act according to what seems most agreeable to us.
I can hear someone objecting right now.
What are you going to say?
They might say, hold on, I have chosen to do things I knew were bad for me. I ate the whole pizza late at night, even though my understanding dictated it was a terrible idea for my health.
They chose the lesser good.
That is a very common misunderstanding of what Edwards means by the understanding and the greatest good.
He is not talking about cold, rational, long-term calculation, is he?
No. He is not talking about what your doctor thinks is best.
He is talking about what appears most agreeable to the mind in the split second the choice is made.
Factoring in all appetites, physical cravings, emotional states, and immediate desires.
In that moment of eating the pizza, the immediate sensory pleasure of the food appeared as a greater good to your mind than the abstract future good of physical health.
Your craving was louder than your logic.
The will still followed the strongest motive present in the understanding at that specific instant.
That makes perfect sense. The strongest motive might be a base appetite, but it is still the strongest motive.
Now, Edward spends a lot of time in this section critiquing an Arminian author named Mr. Chubb.
Chubb tries to have his cake and eat it too.
He argues that motives excite the will, but that the will freely chooses which motive it will yield to.
He says no action can take place without a motive, but the will retains sovereignty over the motives.
Yes, Edward systematically breaks down Chubb's chronological contradiction, and it is a masterpiece of logical dismantling.
Chubb claims the will chooses a motive. But let us look at the timeline.
How can the will choose a motive before that motive has influenced the will?
If the will is choosing which motive to yield to, it is acting. What is the motive for that prior act of choosing?
If the mind chooses to comply with a motive before it falls under its influence, then the motive comes in too late to be the cause of the choice.
It makes the motive both the cause of the choice and the result of the choice at the same time.
It is a total chronological pretzel.
It really is.
Let us say at noon, I have a motive, and 1 second past noon, I make a choice.
Chubb is suggesting the choice at 1 second past noon actually caused the motive to be selected at noon.
An effect cannot precede its cause.
Chubb also says the motive is the passive ground or reason of that action.
And Edwards rightly points out that passive ground is a meaningless phrase.
To excite the will is to actively do something. You cannot have a passive cause.
If the motive excites the will, the motive is causing the volition.
This raises a vital question from the listener's perspective.
When you map it out like a chronological timeline, it starts to sound very deterministic.
Yes, I am going to push back here on behalf of the listener. Does this mean you are just a passive victim of whatever looks most appealing to you?
If your will always follows your strongest motive, and you do not choose your motives because they are shaped by your biology, your upbringing, and your fallen nature, are you just a biological robot reacting to stimuli?
It is the most natural question to ask at this stage.
Edwards clarifies that we are not passive victims of outside forces.
The Arminian framework often confuses necessity with constraint.
Constraint of being forced to do something contrary to your will, like being physically bound and pushed into a room.
You did not want to go in the room, but a stronger physical force compelled you. That destroys freedom.
However, necessity of consequence simply means your choices have reliable causes.
We are acting according to our own internal desires.
You are not a victim of your desires. Your desires are you. They make up your character.
You are doing what you want to do.
Let me use Edwards' example of a hungry man to solidify this idea that we cannot escape our motives.
Okay, the hungry man.
Suppose a man is starving, and you set 2 plates of food in front of him.
One plate has a prime rib, cooked perfectly, which he absolutely loves.
The other plate has stale, moldy bread, which he hates.
According to Chubb's logic of absolute independence, the man might choose the stale bread just to prove his freedom from his physical appetite.
He can neglect the strongest motive and follow the weakest.
But look at the psychology of that choice.
Wow.
If he chooses the stale bread, did he choose it without a prevailing motive?
Not at all. The desire to prove his freedom simply became the new, strongest motive, overriding his physical appetite for the prime rib.
He valued his philosophical pride more than his taste buds in that moment.
The rule remains unbroken. The will always follows the strongest motive.
If you try to act randomly just to prove you're free from motives, your desire to prove your freedom is the motive dictating your random action.
You cannot escape the mechanism.
And Chubb's whole scheme implies that human beings are capable of acting absolutely without motive, which he previously admitted was impossible.
Think about a balance scale.
If you put 10 pounds of weight on the left side and 1 pound of weight on the right, and the scale tips to the right, that would defy the laws of physics.
Similarly, if the mind has a massive motive to choose option A and a tiny insignificant motive to choose option B, and it chooses B, it is acting against the very concept of motivation.
It means the mind can act completely detached from reason.
Edwards points out that if this is what Arminians call liberty, the capacity to act completely detached from reason or motive, that is not a noble privilege.
It reduces human beings to erratic, irrational creatures blown about like smoke in the wind, completely disconnected from understanding or wisdom.
That is a devastating takedown of the entire philosophy.
It shows that what they call freedom is actually just irrational chaos.
Establishing that all human choices are driven by prior motives and causes perfectly sets the stage for the final, most theological argument.
If choices are a chain of causes, how does this interact with the sovereign God who knows the end from the beginning?
Let us transition to the final portion of the text, where Edwards addresses God's foreknowledge and the impossibility of contingence.
Up until now, Edwards has used pure philosophy and logic.
But in sections 11 and 12, he moves into Scripture.
He argues that God's infallible foreknowledge of human actions completely overthrows the Arminian concept of contingent, uncertain free will.
If God knows something will happen, it is absolutely certain it will happen.
And if it is absolutely certain to happen, it is not contingent, it is a fixed, necessary event.
Edwards brings a massive amount of biblical receipts here.
He lists specific prophecies to prove God foreknows the moral choices of individuals.
Let us look at Pharaoh. God tells Moses in Exodus, "I am sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go."
God did not guess Pharaoh's stubbornness based on a personality profile. He knew it with absolute certainty.
Then there is King Josiah.
The Josiah prophecy is incredible. Think about 1 Kings 13.
A prophet cries out against the altar at Bethel.
And foretells Josiah's exact moral conduct, his zealous reforms, destroying the altars, and burning the bones of the priests 300 years before Josiah was even born.
He is called out by name.
This means the specific, free moral actions of Josiah were infallibly known 3 centuries prior to him taking a breath.
And Cyrus. Isaiah prophesies about Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, by name.
He details his mercy to the Jews and his decree to rebuild the temple over 100 years before Cyrus existed.
And of course, the most chilling example, Judas betraying Christ.
Jesus knew who would betray him, and it was prophesied in the song centuries earlier.
Jesus tells Peter he will deny him 3 times before the rooster crows.
These are specific moral choices, infallibly known ahead of time.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Edwards reasons that if God perfectly knows a future event, that event has a certain infallible connection to his knowledge.
If an event might not happen, God could not know it will happen.
You cannot infallibly know something that is fundamentally uncertain.
Knowledge requires evidence. If an event is truly contingent, meaning it has no cause and its outcome is completely up in the air, there is zero evidence of its outcome existing in the universe.
Not even God can see evidence that does not exist.
Therefore, if God knows it, the evidence of its certainty must already exist. The event is fixed.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here using the argument of Dr. Whitby, a prominent Arminian cited by Edwards.
Okay, let us hear Dr. Whitby's argument.
Dr. Whitby says, but God's foreknowledge does not cause the event to happen. Knowing something does not force it to occur.
My knowing the sun will rise tomorrow does not cause the sun to rise.
That is a very common objection.
Edwards' response to it is brilliant because he distinguishes between the cause of the event and the certainty of the event.
He says it does not matter if the foreknowledge causes the event.
The fact that infallible foreknowledge exists proves the event is already a necessary, fixed reality.
Okay, let me make sure I follow that distinction.
Think about it this way. If I have infallible divine knowledge that you will eat an apple tomorrow at noon, my knowledge did not force you to eat the apple.
But my infallible knowledge proves that your eating the apple is a fixed certainty.
It is impossible for you to not eat the apple because if you didn't, my knowledge would have been wrong.
And by definition, infallible knowledge cannot be wrong.
So whether the knowledge caused the event or God's decree caused the event is irrelevant to the question of necessity.
The existence of infallible foreknowledge demonstrates an unbreakable necessary connection between the present and the future.
If it is foreknown, it is fixed.
If it is fixed, it is not contingent.
If it is not contingent, the Arminian definition of free will collapses entirely.
That is a watertight argument. It shifts the burden of proof entirely.
And we have to spend some time speculating on the alternative.
What are the theological implications of a God who does not know the future?
Because to save their definition of free will, some modern theologians, like open theists, have had to bite the bullet and claim God does not actually know future free choices.
The implications of that are disastrous.
If human choices were truly contingent and uncertain, God would be constantly surprised.
He would be forced to alter his plans daily based on what humans decide to do.
He would be repeatedly frustrated by human beings thwarting his designs.
He would be, as Edwards suggests, constantly mending broken links in his cosmic plan as best as he could, reacting rather than ordaining.
That does not sound like the God of the Bible.
The God of Isaiah says, I declare the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure.
If God does not know the future volitions of men, then his grand plan of redemption was built on pure guesswork.
Consider the cross. The crucifixion of Jesus Christ was the climax of human history, predicted in stunning detail throughout the Old Testament.
It required the specific, wicked moral choices of Judas, the Pharisees, Pilate, and the Roman soldiers.
If those choices were contingent and uncertain, then God's promise to save humanity was a gamble.
Jesus might have come to earth, lived a perfect life, and died of old age without ever being crucified, if the human actors had freely chosen differently in an unpredictable way.
And what about the promises of the success of the gospel?
God promises that the knowledge of the Lord will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea.
He promises that Christ will build his church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it.
These promises depend on millions of future human choices to believe the gospel.
If God cannot foresee those choices, those promises are just hopeful wishes.
If God is ignorant of the future, he could be totally frustrated in his end for creating the world.
He could throw a massive wedding banquet for his son, and nobody shows up because they all use their autonomous free will to decline the invitation.
Which is entirely contrary to the biblical portrait of a sovereign creator.
Edwards proves that you cannot hold to absolute contingency of the human will and simultaneously hold to the omniscience and sovereignty of God.
One has to give way. And for Edwards, standing firmly on the Westminster Confession, God's sovereignty is absolute.
Let us summarize this incredible investigation for everyone listening.
Jonathan Edwards successfully proves that the Arminian version of liberty, a will that determines itself, acts without causes, and sits in perfect indifference, is a logical impossibility.
It requires an infinite regress of choices, it defies the universal law of cause and effect, and it invents a psychological state of neutrality that nobody actually experiences.
Instead, our choices are always driven by our strongest motives, shaped by our understanding of what is best in the moment.
And all of history, including our very desires, is securely held in the infallible knowledge and sovereign plan of God.
It is a rigorous, unyielding, logical progression.
He strips away our philosophical pride.
He takes away the illusion that we are independent little gods running our own universes.
He reveals the true mechanics of the human heart. We act according to our greatest desire.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over.
If true freedom is not the ability to act randomly without a cause, but rather the ability to act according to your greatest desire, then the state of your soul comes down to what you desire most.
If you are chained by nature to follow your strongest motives, and your strongest motives are inherently bent away from God due to the fall, you are trapped by your own wants.
You will always freely choose to rebel because that is what you want to do.
Therefore, is true spiritual liberation simply the act of God graciously changing what your heart loves?
That is the core of Reformed theology.
Freedom is not an empty, neutral will. Freedom is a heart given new desires by the Holy Spirit.
So the next time you look at that X-ray of your physical body and appreciate the clean, visible mechanics of a broken bone, you can also appreciate the intricate, unseen, and perfectly sovereign mechanics of your own will.
The diagnostic waters of human choice might look murky to us, but they are crystal clear to the one who designed the mind, weighs our motives, and knows the end from the beginning.
Thank you for joining us today on Reformed Thinking.